This channel is new and our goal is to reach the first 1,000 subscribers. So please subscribe to help us and leave a like so we can continue to bring great stories. Without further ado, let's get to the first story. I thought a long time about whether I should tell this story. After 3 months of intensive therapy, I was advised to speak openly about it. My therapists say it might help, but the truth is I am still afraid he will find out I am talking. Harold, my former supervisor, is now in a psychiatric clinic in Seattle, far away, safe. And yet I wake up every night bathed in sweat. His shadows follow me, even when he is no longer here. Before I continue, a warning: never ignore sudden behavioral changes in people who are isolated for long periods. The signs are always there, flashing red, warning, but often we close our eyes to them. My arrival on platform P71 began as I expected from any other job. The helicopter flight took 3 hours over the gray, endless expanse of the Bering Sea to the platform, located far off the Alaskan coast. Harold, my supervisor, was the one who welcomed me. His tired smile revealed that he knew this place like the back of his hand, as if he were grown into the cold, metallic structures of this lonely world. The crew, a group of 12 people, seemed well coordinated. 3 Brazilians, including me, 6 Americans, 2 Canadians, and a Russian. But one thing stood out immediately. The crew should have been relieved long ago, but the weather ruined our plans. Everyone was forced to stay longer, because the scheduled crew could not reach us due to the storm. An uneasy feeling came over me, but I brushed it aside. As I would soon find out, that was just the beginning. On the second day, I felt a slight discomfort. It was Harold who increasingly irritated me. During his shift, he sat for hours in front of the surveillance monitors, staring at the empty corridors of the platform, as if he saw something hidden from the rest of us. When I confronted him about it, he just smiled strangely and muttered that he was observing patterns. It didn't stop at the screens. Harold began asking me strange questions about my life, my family, and most disturbingly, about where I had been 3 years ago. That night, the meteorologist warned us about an approaching massive storm front, a darkness that settled over the platform like a heavy shadow. The tension among us increased. Each of us knew what it meant to be cut off. No connection to the outside world, no protection from the forces of nature. Just us, isolated in the middle of a raging sea. The feeling of threat grew, and there was an elusive restlessness in the air that only intensified the more Harold seemed to keep an eye on all of us. As the first fringes of the storm hit the platform, the metal walls began to tremble under the pressure of the wind. It felt as if the storm wanted to swallow us. In the midst of this rising apocalypse, Harold began taping notes to the walls of the corridors. I recognized photos of former crew members, old newspaper clippings, and in the middle of the hodgepodge, the picture of a woman, Astrid, his late wife. Her eyes stared at us blankly, as if they were witnesses to the coming disaster. The third night on the platform brought us all to the limit of what we could bear. Harold's behavior became increasingly sinister and unsettled. Even the toughest among us. He began to seal off certain areas of the platform, claiming that preventive maintenance work was necessary there. Some colleagues suddenly found themselves locked in their quarters without understanding why. More and more, Harold took control of all communication devices, as if he wanted to ensure that no information left the platform. The most disturbing thing, however, was his new, strange way of handling the radio. He sat in the command center for hours, eyes fixed on the blinking device, while he whispered softly into the dead channel. He spoke with a gentleness that seemed inappropriate, as if he were actually expecting a familiar voice on the other end. When I tried to listen, I could hardly understand his words. Only a few fragments penetrated the static. but it was enough to anchor the discomfort in me. Every time he approached me or others, his eyes were empty, almost like those of a stranger staring at us through a mask. It was as if Harold was only observing us from the outside, as if he no longer belonged to this world. At the same time, the storm around us grew into a merciless monster. The platform shook under the pressure of the waves, which threw themselves against the steel of the structure like fists. We were prisoners, held fast by a sinister force. The thought sprouted in me that we were not only at the mercy of the storm, but also of a madness that was becoming ever more tangible. Harold's notes and pictures seemed like a disturbing mosaic, a glimpse into his disturbed mind, and we, his prisoners, were the figures in his destroyed game. As the night deepened and the storm unfolded its full power, Harold's behavior reached a new climax. He had begun to look at us like intruders. Again and again, I saw him wandering through the corridors, his eyes searching for something or someone, while the howling of the wind echoed through the steel grid of the platform outside. Inside we only heard the mournful creaking of the metal, as if it were groaning under the weight of madness itself. In a rare pause, when I stood alone in the hallway, I noticed one of Harold's papers that he had apparently overlooked. On it was a series of sketches, tangled lines, circles, and in the middle, the face of a woman, Astrid. With a trembling hand, I turned the paper over and realized that a handwritten note was hidden underneath. "They are watching me. I will find the truth." The sentence sent a shiver down my spine as I realized that Harold was convinced we were all part of a plot against him. With every hour that passed, Harold locked down more areas of the platform. He moved like a guard, always more vigilant, always more determined to isolate us from each other. I saw the restlessness in the faces of my colleagues. The Russian technician whispered to me that he had had enough, that we were trapped in a cage whose key only Harold possessed, a cage of madness and isolation. At some point toward the end of the night, I heard him speaking in the dark, as if someone were with him. His voice was whispered, almost affectionate. "Astrid, I will find out soon. I promise you." The words faded in the noise of the storm, but the cold shudder they left behind remained. I realized Harold was absolutely determined to find the truth, and nothing would stop him, even if it meant we would all become part of his dark puzzle. Then, the next morning, the situation had become barely tolerable. Harold barely seemed to sleep. His eyes were red and sunken, and his skin stretched pale and unhealthy over his cheeks. But it wasn't just his exhausted appearance that caused us discomfort. It was the way he looked at us, as if we were strangers in his realm. Every time one of us came too close to him, he withdrew, placing a protective hand over his radio, as if he wanted to protect something only he could understand. His new behavior consisted of locking certain doors on the platform without any explanation. The kitchen supplies were suddenly difficult to access, and the doors to the sleeping areas were repeatedly locked without warning. Some colleagues began to converse in whispers in the hallways. The feeling of threat grew with every minute. I saw it in their eyes, the distrust, the question of how long we could endure this state. It was in the afternoon, when things came to a head. An emergency call device in the recreation room suddenly began to beep, a sign that someone was trying to make contact with the outside world. Harold's reaction was lightning fast. He rushed to the device, turned it off, and stood there for a moment, his eyes narrowed in cold determination. Then, without warning, he began to reproach us. "You want to betray me," he hissed with a trembling voice, and in his gaze lay a mixture of anger and despair. It was as if he was convinced that we were all working against him, as if we posed a threat to his truth. The atmosphere on the platform was unbearably dense. The storm raged on outside, while inside an even more dangerous storm was brewing. I realized that we were not only at the mercy of the forces of nature, but also of a man who was slowly and unstoppably falling into an abyss that would swallow him, and perhaps all of us. The nights on the platform had meanwhile taken on an unreal quality. Sleep became a luxury that hardly any of us could afford, because the constant tension that settled over us like a thick fog left us little peace. The metallic walls seemed to reflect Harold's madness, as if they were changing with him, narrowing, while we felt more and more trapped. During one of those nights, as I crept through the endless, dimly lit corridors of the platform, I discovered Harold's diary left carelessly on the table in the command center. I opened it without thinking and found pages full of confused notes and drawings. The last entries were particularly disturbing. They were meticulous records about the death of his wife Astrid. One page contained details that only an investigator would know, shocking clues that Astrid's death had not just been an accident, as they had wanted us to believe. With growing horror, I read on and came across names and accusations. Harold firmly believed that someone from our team was responsible for her death. His notes eventually targeted one person, Eric, the Canadian technician who had been working on the platform for 3 years. The details were so precise and so obsessively recorded that I felt the air around me thinning. I realized that Harold was not simply giving in to a delusion. He had a plan. I heard footsteps and hastily closed the diary. My heart pounded fiercely. Harold stood in the doorway, his eyes flashing suspiciously. "What are you doing here?" he asked in a voice that sounded dangerously calm. I could only stammer. But in that moment I understood that the real storm was not raging outside the platform, but inside the mind of this man, who was ready to sacrifice everything to bring his personal truth to light. On the evening of the third day, the situation finally escalated. Harold gathered us all in the dining hall without warning and locked the doors behind us. The tension was palpable. Each of us felt that this moment crossed the boundary of what we still considered controllable. With a trembling hand, Harold held a heavy pipe wrench, his eyes glittering with a mixture of rage and despair. He was no longer the man who had welcomed us upon our arrival. He was a stranger driven by a dark goal. "Tonight we will finally bring the truth to light," he said, in a quiet but insistent voice. No one dared to move as he slowly turned to Eric. The atmosphere in the room was unbearable, and I felt the hair on the back of my neck stand up. Harold's voice grew louder, firmer, as he began to accuse Eric directly. He asked questions, revealed details from Eric's past that no one but Harold could have known. Eric tried to stay calm and said that Harold was mistaken. But Harold would not be calmed. He presented more and more evidence, weaving facts and assumptions into a web that seemed so impenetrable that even we slowly began to doubt Eric's innocence. The pipe wrench in Harold's hand seemed to grow heavier with every word, a dark promise of what might follow. When Harold finally stood directly in front of Eric, the latter burst into tears. The tension had worn him down, and under the pressure of the accusations, he began to tremble. The air in the room was stuffy, almost suffocating, as we witnessed a moment that seemed like the end of a long, dark path. The storm outside was nothing compared to the storm raging in this room, a storm of distrust, anger, and unspoken truths. Under the relentless pressure of Harold's accusations, Eric finally collapsed. His face was pale, his hands trembled, and a deep guilt was reflected in his eyes. With a voice that was barely more than a whisper, he began to speak and revealed a terrible secret that cut through the silence of the room like a dagger. Eric confessed that he had indeed had an affair with Astrid. The shockwave that went through the room was palpable. No one had expected the accusations to have a core of truth. He spoke of nights he had secretly spent with her, of promises they had made to each other, and of the shared hope for a future. But then everything changed. Astrid suddenly withdrew, felt guilty, and decided not to leave Harold. She wanted to end the affair, but Eric could not bear this loss. In a moment of despair and anger, he confessed he had poisoned her. A soft, barely noticeable sound escaped Harold's throat, a mixture of pain and rage, as the words spread through him like poison. The silence that followed Eric's confession was oppressive. No one dared to breathe, no one dared to speak. Harold stood as if turned to stone, but his eyes sparkled with a rage that seemed uncontrollable. Then, without warning, he lunged at Eric with the pipe wrench. The attack was so sudden that we all recoiled. Some screamed. In the ensuing panic, we tried to pull the two apart, but Harold's anger was unleashed. Hands and fists flew, screams filled the room, and I felt myself getting injured in the chaos as well. It was an inferno of despair and hatred that none of us would ever forget. Amidst the chaos and the agitated screams of the crew, the waves continued to crash against the platform, as if they wanted to swallow the violent scene. It felt as if the entire world was trapped in the confines of this dining hall, at the mercy of the raging fury of a man who had lost everything. It took agonizing minutes until we finally managed to separate Harold and Eric. Blood oozed from several faces, hands were torn, clothes shredded. Eric lay heavily injured on the floor, his eyes glassy and full of pain. Then finally, almost as an answer to our silent pleas, the storm outside slowly began to subside. The wind died down, the metallic structures of the platform seemed to stand more stably again, and the roar of the sea lost its menace. With the calming of the storm, we also got back the long-awaited radio connection to the outside world. The words of the rescue team were like a distant hope that could tear us from the nightmare. Help was on the way, and we only had to hold out a little longer. The minutes until the arrival of the rescue felt like an eternity. Harold sat in a corner of the room, his hands trembling, his eyes staring into the void, as if he had used up all his strength in this frenzy of revenge. Eric lay on the floor, pale and moaning softly. The remaining crew members were silent, too exhausted and traumatized to speak. Each of us was lost in thought. And yet I felt that an invisible connection held us at this point. We were survivors, witnesses to a human drama that lay beyond our imagination. When the rescue team finally arrived, Harold and Eric were taken to safety in different conditions, but both severely scared. It was over. Or so we thought, at least. But in everyone's faces remained a shadow that followed us like a silent echo of the horror. 3 months have passed since that fateful night, but the memories have burned deep into my consciousness. Eric was imprisoned and is waiting for his verdict, which will decide his life. Harold, on the other hand, is in a psychiatric clinic in Seattle. His reality fluctuates between lucid moments and dark phases of obsessive delusion. For him, the search for answers never ends, even if the world around him already knows them. For me too. Those hours on the platform have not passed. For nights on end, I cannot find sleep, because the images keep returning to my memory. The roaring of the storm, the shrill screeching of the metal, the desperate screams, and Harold's eyes looking at us as if we were enemies in his personal war. Every dream, every nocturnal sound makes me wake up bathed in sweat, as if I could never escape the shadow of these events. I therefore want to leave you with one last warning. If you ever work or live in isolation, pay attention to the people around you. Behavioral changes, no matter how subtle they may seem, should never be ignored. The signs were always there, like flashing lights warning us of an abyss, but we didn't want to see them. I have learned that the human psyche can be as unfathomable and unpredictable as the sea. a storm that lurks deep within us and can destroy everything when unleashed. And so all that remains for me is to conclude with this advice: observe the behavior of the people around you. And above all, do not wait until the next wave breaks to act, because sometimes the greatest danger hides not in the chaos of nature, but in the silent abysses of the human soul. Next true horror story. I thought long and hard about whether I should tell this story. Actually, I am breaking several confidentiality agreements of my company by doing so, but the truth must come to light. I spent 3 weeks on an oil rig, and this time turned into my personal nightmare. What happened there haunts me to this day. It was the P-33, a platform in the middle of nowhere. The waves of the ocean surrounded us from all sides, and the isolated silence amplified the feeling of confinement. When you work so far away from civilization, you tend to trust your instinct or ignore it for fear of appearing unprofessional. That was my first mistake. It began with small, inconspicuous anomalies, things that seemed trivial when viewed individually. A strange look here, a misunderstanding there. But at some point, I could no longer shake off the discomfort. Something was wrong, and this premonition would soon be confirmed. Over the past 6 months, the platform had recorded 5 unexplained leaks. As a specialist in damage limitation, I had seen a lot. But this time was different. The chemicals we extracted from the leaks contained typical residues, traces that raised questions, but provided no answers. Then Sarah Chan, a new safety engineer, approached me. "The leaks follow a strange pattern," she whispered. "They always occur exactly 2 days after a resignation or transfer. That's no coincidence." Her words sounded like a warning, and she was right. Things would get much worse than I could ever imagine back then. Sarah's words gnawed at me. A feeling of unrest spread, as if I were looking into deep water whose bottom I couldn't see. Her observation was too specific to be ignored. Why should leaks always occur shortly after a resignation? As someone who systematically investigates problems, I knew that patterns are rarely coincidental. But what connection existed between technical malfunctions and the sudden disappearance of employees? I began to look more closely at logs and reports. The leaks had occurred in different places, always in hard-to-reach sections of the platform. Each time, it involved chemicals that did not seem to fit our operations at first glance. They were similar to those normally used in medical care, and that is exactly where it got weird. My first suspicion was directed at the medical staff. I wondered if they might have handled the substances negligently. But when I talked to others, nothing pointed to carelessness. Everyone praised Dr. Morrison highly. He was an experienced doctor, always there when someone needed him. The epitome of professionalism, calm, reliable, and always ready to take on extra shifts. But the more I thought about him, the stronger the discomfort grew in me. It wasn't just his tireless dedication that caught my attention, but something deeper. An expression in his eyes, hard to grasp. A look I noticed in patients before they got sick, as if he already knew they would soon need his help. Sarah and I decided to investigate further. She began to go through the recordings of the security cameras, and indeed we found something that made us both shudder. The cameras on the lower levels always failed whenever one of the mysterious leaks occurred. It was as if someone deliberately wanted to prevent us from seeing what was going on down there. Our questions piled up, and every new discovery was a step further into the darkness. The deeper we dug, the darker the picture that unfolded before us. Sarah was convinced that something big was being covered up, but every new lead led to more puzzles. Why did the security cameras fail exactly when leaks occurred? And why did the employees who had requested a transfer or resignation seemed to get sick shortly afterwards. All these employees had one thing in common: they were treated by Dr. Morrison before they left the platform. What initially looked like a chain of unfortunate coincidences slowly took the shape of a disturbing pattern. I remembered the last major problem that had affected the platforms: a mysterious outbreak of food poisoning. 10 employees were affected, and of course it was Morrison who took care of them. He had worked through almost 2 nights to ensure everyone was treated. Back then, I considered that admirable. Not anymore. It wasn't just his care that troubled me, but the sharp contrast to his detached manner. He didn't seem like someone who helped people because he cared about them, but rather as if he was watching them closely. He was attentive, almost too attentive, as if passing judgment on them while treating them. I brought this up with Sarah, and we decided to follow the clues more closely. What we found made my blood run cold. Morrison had access to the personal files of all employees, including their medical records and their entire pasts. He knew everything. Every medical treatment, every psychological evaluation, every detail that had ever been documented. And that wasn't all. He also knew who was seeking a transfer. Our eyes met, and we both knew this was bigger than we initially thought. We had touched the first thread of a web that would prove to be far more dangerous than we could have imagined. With every new discovery, the web tightened. We found out that the chemicals in the leaks resembled those Morrison had in stock in the infirmary. Substances intended for medical purposes that could become dangerous in the wrong hands. But the most terrifying thing was what Sarah also found out: the employees who had asked for a transfer all got sick shortly before their departure. Every time, it was Dr. Morrison who took care of their treatment. Sarah analyzed the security protocols further and noticed something else eerie. Some of the security cameras in the lower corridors were not just randomly defective, they were deliberately turned off, always at the same times, and always when something crucial happened. It was almost as if someone had planned the gaps to be able to act unseen. The deeper we dug, the clearer the picture became. Morrison used his position not only to treat patients, but also to hide something. His clinical professionalism was only a facade. Behind it lay a cold precision with which he selected people. And they weren't just any people, but always those who tried to leave the platform. Why? But what was the purpose behind all this? A mere coincidence hypothesis could no longer explain it. Morrison had access to the most intimate information of the employees, their medical files, their psychological profiles, and, as we now suspected, their secret histories. Some of those affected had incriminating past entries, pointing to criminal records or personal misconduct. That couldn't be a coincidence. We were on the verge of making a connection between all these puzzle pieces when the feeling of threat became real. Someone knew we were asking too many questions. And in a world where trust is the only thing keeping you alive on the open sea, the knowledge that we were being followed hit like a shot in the dark. What we didn't know yet was that the worst was yet to come. It was a gut decision that led me to follow Dr. Morrison that day. He had something about him that wouldn't let me go. His movements always seemed deliberate, as if he planned every second of his day carefully. But when I saw him secretly making his way to the lower levels of the platform, I knew something was going on here that I couldn't ignore. The lower corridors were deserted, cold, and damp from the salty air seeping through the cracks of the old structure. Only the soft hum of the machines and the distant clinking of metal accompanied me as I tiptoed after Morrison. Finally, he stopped in front of a door. An old rusty door that should have been out of service for months. However, it was open. A crack was enough to see what was hidden behind it. What I saw made the blood freeze in my veins. Shelves full of chemicals that didn't appear anywhere on the inventory lists. Old yellowed newspaper clippings were taped to the walls, reports of crimes committed by offshore workers, violent crimes, fraud, domestic abuse. It was no random collection. Many of the faces pictured looked familiar to me. They were former employees of the platform, people who had suddenly quit or asked for a transfer. The realization hit me like a blow. Dr. Morrison had his own agenda. He wasn't just a doctor, he was a judge. He decided who was allowed to live on and who was not. His access to the medical records and his medical knowledge gave him the means to select employees with incriminating pasts. And the mysterious chemicals in the secret chamber, they were part of his perfidious plan. With a pounding heart, I retreated before Morrison noticed me. It was clear to me that what I had seen went far beyond simple misconduct. It was a carefully constructed plan that allowed him to present himself as a savior while secretly judging and eliminating. But I knew that if I confronted Morrison, there would be no easy way out. He was too smart, too systematic, and I had already gotten too close to him. The wind picked up, and the horizon was covered with dark clouds when the disaster got a name, Hurricane Catherine. The weather radar showed that the storm would hit us head-on. The platform frantically prepared for the arrival. Safety protocols were activated, equipment secured. But inside me, a much more dangerous storm was raging. I had just discovered the truth about Dr. Morrison, and I knew I was running out of time, while the crew focused on the impending force of nature. Sarah and I immersed ourselves in the documents we had found in the secret chamber. A disturbing truth came to light. Every single disappeared employee had a criminal past. Some were convicted fraudsters, others arrested for serious offenses. They had tried to start a new life on the platform, but Morrison hadn't given them a second chance. He had decided that their past was their sentence. Sarah found evidence in the system logs that confirmed our worst fears. Every time someone disappeared, one of the mysterious leaks occurred at the same time. Morrison used the maintenance as an excuse to dispose of his victims via the chemical dosing systems. The leaks were not a coincidence. They were part of his plan. He's playing God. Sarah whispered, while the wind outside grew louder. He decides. Her face was pale, and I could see she was tormented by the same questions as me. How far would we go to stop him? And what if no one believed us? But there was no time for doubts. The storm was only hours away, and if we didn't act quickly, we would fall victim not only to the hurricane, but also to Morrison. The communication systems were already vulnerable, and it was only a matter of time before Morrison took the chance to silence us for good. I felt the growing pressure, a feeling as if the air around me was getting thicker and more unbearable. The storm outside was nothing compared to what was brewing inside here. The moment of confrontation came faster than I expected. I had returned to the lower levels to secure more evidence when I suddenly heard footsteps behind me. When I turned around, Dr. Morrison stood in the doorway, calm yet lurking like a predator. His eyes sparkled with a strange mixture of superiority and satisfaction. "You figured it out, didn't you?" he said quietly, almost as if he were praising me for it. "But you don't understand. Everything I do is necessary. These people are scum, criminals, fraudsters, monsters. I'm just doing what society doesn't dare to do." I couldn't believe how calm he remained as he spoke these words. Not a hint of remorse, no doubts, only the deep, firmly rooted belief that he was right. For him, these purges were not a crime, but a mission he saw as his moral duty. "Don't you see?" He took a step closer, his voice darkening. "Nobody misses these people. Nobody asks about them. I'm doing the world a favor." I was frozen with horror, but I knew I had to act now. Morrison was dangerous not only because of his methods, but because of his conviction. He had the ability to justify his actions with a cold logic that tolerated no contradiction. As I tried to retreat to the door, a syringe flashed in his hand. "I'm sorry, but you won't stop me. You simply won't understand." He slowly approached me, every step deliberate and threatening. In that moment, I knew there was no turning back. Sarah was somewhere upstairs, hopefully safe. But I was alone in these cold, deserted corridors, and Morrison wouldn't hesitate to silence me. The storm outside was already raging, and I heard the howling of the wind through the metal walls of the platform. But the real danger stood right in front of me. With a calm smile and a syringe in his hand, I ran without looking back. Morrison's footsteps echoed behind me through the narrow metal corridors, while the howling of the storm outside grew louder. The hurricane shook the platform like a toy, and every step felt as if the floor beneath me was giving way. But I knew the real threat wasn't the storm, but the man chasing me. Morrison called after me, his voice overlaid by the roar of the wind. "You don't understand. I'm doing the right thing. They all deserve to disappear." His madness was unmistakable, yet his tone was calm, almost friendly. It was this eerie calmness that made my blood run cold. I tried to keep a clear head. The communication systems were sabotaged. We were cut off from the outside world. My only way out was to activate the emergency protocols. But to do that, I had to make it to the control center before Morrison caught up with me. The corridors turned into a labyrinth of shadows and swaying structures. The storm lashed against the outer walls, and every impact made the platform shudder. As I turned a corner, I almost collided with Sarah. She was holding a bleeding wound on her side and was pale with pain. "He got me," she panted. "But it's not deep." We had no time for questions. I supported her, and together we fought our way through the corridors. Morrison wasn't far away. We could hear his footsteps, accompanied by the cold echo of his voice cutting through the hallways. "You won't make it. You can't stop it." In the distance, I saw the door to the control center. It was our only chance to outsmart the storm and Morrison at the same time. I knew we had to act fast before the hurricane tore the platform apart, or Morrison caught us. With pounding hearts, we reached the door and slammed it behind us. But we knew that wasn't the end. In the control center, there was gloomy, flickering light. The glaring flashing of the alarms mixed with the raging storm outside, as if nature itself was warning us. Sarah leaned against a console, breathing heavily, while I frantically activated the emergency protocols. We didn't have a second to lose. Morrison would show up any second. I managed to unlock the system. The security indicator flashed green as the automatic fire suppression system in the lower levels was activated. A loud hiss sounded, followed by the dull thud of heavy bulkheads sealing the rooms and flooding them with foam. My plan was simple: trap Morrison down there and stop him from causing any more havoc. But he wouldn't be stopped so easily. Just seconds later, the door to the control center crashed open, and there he stood, wet from the foam, but with an unshakable grin on his face. The syringe flashed in his hand again. "You really thought that would stop me?" His voice was calm, almost mocking. In that moment, there was no more room to run. I knew I had to stop him here and now. While the floor beneath us swayed menacingly and metal crunched under the pressure of the storm, I stepped toward him. He lunged at me, the syringe raised in his hand, a silent promise to silence me forever. But the platform had other plans. A sudden jolt threw him off balance. He stumbled, and before he could catch himself, he stepped on one of his own dropped syringes. A choked gasp escaped his lips as the needle pierced his skin. His eyes widened, and for the first time, I saw fear in them. I backed away and watched as he sank to the floor, his hand desperately grasping for air. The storm outside was gradually subsiding, but in here, between metal and shadows, Morrison's deadly game finally came to an end. The hurricane had let us live, and the monster that had hidden behind a smile now lay trapped in its own madness. The minutes after Morrison's fall felt like an eternity. The storm outside was gradually subsiding, but the chaos continued to rage inside me. Sarah leaned exhausted against the wall, her breathing shallow but alive. We had survived against the madness, against the storm, against the darkness in these corridors. But it wasn't over yet. As the sky began to clear, we finally heard the sound of rotor blades. The rescue helicopter was there. With trembling hands, I transmitted our coordinates over the emergency system. We had made it. But the questions wouldn't let me go. How many people had fallen victim to Morrison? And above all, why had no one noticed anything sooner? The subsequent investigation brought gruesome details to light. Morrison's records were kept meticulously. He had deemed 12 people unworthy and eliminated them with cold, calculating precision. He had selected his victims as if it were a scientific study. A manifesto was found in his possession in which he laid out his disturbing philosophy, a world that had to be cleansed of impure elements. Sarah survived the attack, but she would need a long time to recover from her injuries. Platform P-33 was shut down, a symbol of the madness hidden in the secluded corners of the world. No one ever wanted to return there. Now, months later, I still struggle with the memories. Every encounter with a doctor or a hospital makes the hair on the back of my neck stand up. The idea that someone like Morrison lives among us, dressed in white and with a friendly smile, haunts me. My final advice is simply trust your instinct. If something feels wrong, it probably is. The most dangerous monsters don't hide in the dark. They wear white coats and smile. And they believe that what they are doing is right. The real threat doesn't always come from storms or forces of nature. It comes from people who decide the fate of others in the name of their twisted ideals. And that is the worst storm of all. Next true horror story. I have to tell what happened on the Carn Oil 7, even if it might cost me my career, or worse. The official investigations are being covered up, and people need to know the truth. For anyone working on older facilities, especially those with a history of accidents, consider this a warning. Sometimes the past isn't as dead as we believe, and most importantly, if old machines suddenly start running on their own again, don't ignore it. It could be someone trying to warn you. My night shift began as usual. As a radio operator, I monitored the communication channels of the oil rig between 8 p.m. and 8 a.m. On the third night, I heard it for the first time, a faint crackling on frequency 87.9, a frequency that had been abandoned since the accident of 1989. A voice distorted by static noise, Anna Tunitz Nova, I noted in the log, but no one paid it any attention. Maybe they thought it was a technical error. Maybe they were already too used to the hum of the machines and the isolated tones that sometimes echo through the frequencies. But I couldn't forget it. In the following nights, the transmissions became more frequent, clearer. Every time it was the same voice, the same frequency, trying to tell me something. Eerie coordinates, numbers of valves, warnings about rising pressure. Each of these details awakened a vague fear in me, but also a painful curiosity. Lila, the technician in charge of maintenance, eventually confirmed that these numbers and clues corresponded to real equipment on the platform. And even more disturbing was that some of them matched exactly those that had played a role in the 1989 accident. With every night, frequency 87.9 became more alive. It wasn't just a coincidence. The messages were full of details that only someone who had worked on the platform back then could know. These messages scared me, but I couldn't escape the fascination. The coordinates transmitted led me to machines that should have been decommissioned long ago. Every valve, every number was real, and that is exactly what troubled me. One night, I found Lila in a darkened room of the platform. She was hunched over old blueprints, her eyes tired and strained. She had found out that the numbers and devices mentioned in the messages actually belonged to critical parts of the facility. These parts were not only old, but they showed signs of recent manipulation. The valves. They've been changed, Layla whispered with a restlessness that pierced right through me. What if the old stories, the old warnings weren't just inventions? When we confronted Mikhail about it, he became restless. Normally he was calm and controlled, but now he showed an unusual reaction. His face hardened, his voice sharpy. Those are just old ghost stories, he said emphatically, waving us off. But his eyes said something else. There was a kind of fear that was hard to hide. Maybe it was just my imagination, but in his eyes I saw something I recognized. A burden someone only carries when hiding something. The nocturnal messages became increasingly clear, almost as if they wanted us to understand. One night, the voice was clearer than before. Check the valves. Every time I heard these words, I got goosebumps. Was it really just the echo of the past, or was it a sign that something big, something dangerous was imminent? The more we dug, the deeper the shadows of the past hovering over the platform became. On a quiet night, when the sea below us glittered like a black mass, I decided to score the old records. I used my access during the night shift and opened the digital archives that no one had looked at for a long time. The reports of the 1989 accident were harrowing. 23 people had lost their lives, and only a single survivor had made it back to shore. Mikhail Petrov, then a young engineer. In the old photographs I found, I barely recognized him. The man in the pictures was far from the cool and controlled supervisor we knew. His eyes reflected something else, something I knew from my time in the Navy. Guilt. This realization made me shudder. What if Mikhail was not just a survivor, but also one of those responsible for what happened back then? While the nocturnal messages became more urgent, the machines on the platform also began to fail. Lila was the first to notice the irregular patterns in the systems, as if someone or something was taking control. Every time frequency 87.9 became active, it almost seemed as if the devices sprang to life on their own, as if responding to something. The valves trembled, and the metal of the platform began to creak softly during the transmissions, as if the machines themselves were recalling a memory. On those nights, I heard the voice again, now clear and insistent. Hey, we'll do it again. Same method. Same valves. These words wouldn't let me go. Whoever was giving this warning knew something we didn't understand yet. A plan laying over the platform like an invisible net. I realized we weren't just dealing with an old story here. It was more, a puzzle just waiting to be solved. With each new night, the feeling intensified that the events of 1989 had never really concluded. Leela and I delved into the maintenance logs, which often had gaps. Finally, we found something remarkable. Someone had secretly reactivated certain machines that had been shut down for decades. These valves and devices, which according to reports were supposed to be untouched since the disaster, showed fresh traces of manipulation. It was as if the past was deliberately being brought back into the present. I found Mikhail increasingly hard to read. His behavior became more unpredictable, almost as if he were fighting with himself. Most of the time he was the strict, distant supervisor, but in rare moments, a strange nervousness flashed through. Once, I found him alone in the old control room that hardly anyone ever entered. He stood in front of the outdated control panels, muttering softly something I couldn't understand. The old buttons flickered faintly in the twilight, and Mikhail's facial expression looked tormented, almost like a painful memory. That night, I heard the voice over the radio frequency again. And this time it was clearer than ever before. Hay will recreate the same conditions. These words sounded like a dark prophecy. What if someone was really trying to repeat the accident? What if Mikhail knew more than he admitted, and was now part of a dangerous game that threatened the entire platform? The next few days and nights I spent with Layla. We continued to score the old reports and system records. Slowly, a terrible picture came together. The warnings from the voice seemed to provide precise clues to problems in the systems, as if trying to guide us. Layla was as shaken as I was. Why would anyone do such a thing? She whispered, her gaze sweeping over the endless pipes and valves of the platform. The answer lay hidden somewhere, and we were forced to bring the truth to light before it was too late. The more we found out, the clearer it became to us that something dark was going on at the Karn Oil 7. Layla discovered that devices that should have been turned off long ago were in fact being manipulated regularly. On one particularly disturbing night, she realized that some of the critical valves had been altered just recently. We found traces indicating that someone was deliberately trying to restore the conditions of that time from the year 1989. The nocturnal radio transmissions on frequency 87.9, distorted by the static of the waves, gave specific instructions. Check the valves. It felt as if someone was trying to warn us of a danger that only a few of us understood, while Layla and I followed the words of the voice and checked the valves. We discovered signs that Mikhail might bear the responsibility for these secret manipulations. On another night, I surprised Mikhail in the old control room. He stood in front of the powered down panels, talking softly to himself. His hands trembled over the outdated controls. When he noticed me, he jumped, but tried to hide his nervousness. "You don't understand this," he muttered curtly before leaving the room. That sentence haunted me. What exactly was there to understand here? Why was Mikhail behaving so strangely, and what was he trying to hide from us? Layla and I were now sure. The voice speaking through the radio came from someone who knew exactly what was happening on the platform. But the biggest question remained unanswered. Why would someone want to recreate the tragic conditions of 1989? It was a deadly puzzle that drew us deeper and deeper into the dark past of the platform. As the machines around us screamed, we felt time was running out. Something was approaching, and we had to be ready. The radio transmission at 3:17 a.m. was the clearest I had ever heard. "He will do it again. Same method, same valves. No accident." These words left no more doubts. Someone was deliberately trying to recreate the tragic event of 1989. It felt as if the past had come alive, determined to force its dark truth upon us. Layla and I compared the coordinates and information from the messages with the old reports. Every detail matched. Mikhail was recreating the events of back then with frightening precision. We were facing a terrible realization. A new company investigation was underway and would soon bring the truth about the 1989 incident to light. Obviously, Mikhail had decided that this had to be prevented at all costs. As we dove deeper into the details, a picture full of desperation and betrayal emerged. Mikhail's actions were not an act of randomness. It was a plan aimed at destroying the platform and taking all the evidence that could incriminate him down with it. We feverishly began taking the necessary safety measures, but Mikhail was one step ahead of us. The communication channels were blocked, and any possibility of alerting external help was cut off. The platform lay isolated in the darkness of the ocean, while the metallic groaning and moaning of the pipes and valves grew louder and louder. It was as if the entire facility knew what was coming, as if it too wanted to warn us of Mikhail's sinister intentions. Layla looked at me with an expression of determination and fear. "We can't just let him," she whispered, as the roar of the machines swelled around us. The air was oppressive, charged with the knowledge that we were heading towards a final confrontation. As the minutes passed and frequency 87.9 remained silent, we knew there would soon be no turning back. The truth had to come to light, whatever the cost. It was a night of storms, the air saturated with electricity and tension. When I finally confronted Mikhail near the pressure control facility, the platform trembled under the lashing waves, and the wind howled around the old steel beams. Mikhail stood in front of the control panels, his hands trembling as he made the final adjustments. When he noticed me, he paused briefly, a cold expression in his eyes that wavered between guilt and determination. "You don't understand," he muttered hoarsely, without really looking at me. "The accident back then. I had to cover up the first mistake. And now I have to cover up everything." His voice was brittle, as if the weight of his own words was overwhelming him. In that moment, he confessed that his negligence in 1989 had caused the disaster. For years he had obscured the truth with bribery and lies. But now that a new investigation was imminent, he seemed ready to give up everything, including the platform and everyone working on it. A cold shiver ran down my spine. Everything we had learned over the past nights came together into a dark mosaic. Mikhail's plan was not just an act of desperation. It was a desperate attempt to bury his secrets forever, regardless of the consequences. His hands hovered over the switches, as if he couldn't yet dare to take the final step, while his eyes stared into the void. "There is no other choice left," he said almost to himself, as if apologizing for what he was about to do. But I couldn't let him drag us all into the darkness with him. A spark of anger and determination overcame me, and without further hesitation, I grabbed his hands and pulled them away from the control switches. He fought back, his eyes burning with rage and despair, but I held him tight. The fate of the platform and our lives hung by a thread, and in that moment, I knew we were fighting for our existence. The next few minutes passed like a feverish blur. Lila and I desperately tried to reverse the damage, while Mikhail raged nearby, watching us furiously. He had blocked the platform's communication systems, and every attempt to reach outside help was interrupted. The machines around us groaned under the increasing strain, as the pressure valves swelled relentlessly. The platform itself seemed alive, like a creature suffering under the agony of the past and impending disaster. While I struggled with the control system, the radio signals on frequency 87.9 reached a new climax. The words were frantic and full of urgency, almost as if other night shift workers, who were observing the platform from afar, were trying to warn us over the old system. These were not ghosts from the past. These were other people who had noticed something strange in the platform's data and were now trying to reach us. They had realized that something big and threatening was underway. Lila worked feverishly on the valves while I monitored the frequency. The messages grew louder, more insistent. The words, "Hey, we'll destroy everything," echoed through the static. And in that moment, I knew time was running out. We were on our own, dealing with a man determined to take the platform and his dark secrets down with him. The air was oppressive, full of smoke and the metallic smell of machines pushed to their limits. In a desperate attempt, I reached for the emergency control panel and began to activate the emergency system that Mikhail hadn't sabotaged yet. It was our last chance to stabilize the platform and secure the remaining systems. Lila looked at me, her eyes full of determination and fear, while Mikhail made one last attempt to stop us. The minutes ticked by as if in slow motion. The crackling and roaring of the machines grew louder. The end seemed inevitably near, but we still had a spark of hope. In the old control room, the tension reached its peak. Mikhail was completely beside himself, his eyes sparkling with rage and despair. When I played him the recordings, I had secretly made of his confessions. These pieces of evidence were our last trump card to bring the truth to light. Even if the platform was destroyed, Mikhail realized the threat these recordings posed to him, and in a fit of madness, he tried to destroy them. He reached for the devices, lashing out wildly, damaging critical controls in the process. Meanwhile, Layla had alerted as many colleagues as possible and initiated an evacuation. She knew the stability of the platform was at stake, and that Mikhail was willing to risk everything to keep his guilt in the dark. The metallic groaning of the platform became unbearable, and every part of the facility seemed to creak under the pressure. As we fought for control over the last safety systems, Mikhail and I grappled with each other while the ominous roar of the machines grew louder. The platform swayed beneath us, and every second, it seemed as if it might give way at any moment. Finally, in a desperate attempt to bring the situation under control, Mikhail threw himself at me with full force. But in the chaos, he lost his balance and fell onto the exposed metal parts of the console. A heavy crack broke through the background noise, and Mikhail lay motionless. The platform was now in an absolute state of emergency. Layla and I knew it was only a matter of seconds until the critical systems failed completely. With our last ounce of strength, we managed to initiate the final emergency measures. The lights flickered, the sound of the machines gradually died away, and an eerie silence settled over the platform. Layla and I looked at each other as the cold, pale light of morning broke over the horizon. We had survived, but the traces of horror would stay with us forever. The Karn Oil 7 survived, but only barely. The structure was severely damaged, and the memories of that night, of what we had lived through on the platform, could not be easily suppressed. Mikhail had not survived. His fall onto the exposed metal parts had cost him his life, and with his last breath, he had revealed the whole truth. The investigations following his death eventually uncovered decades of cover-ups and bribery. Mikhail had entangled himself in a web of guilt and secrets that finally swallowed him. Frequency 87.9. It turned out it had been used for years by a circle of night shift workers who secretly shared data and observations. These workers had noticed the discrepancies and the danger, but were powerless against the cover-ups and lies surrounding the platform. Their warnings had never been voices from the past. They were real people desperately trying to alert us to the danger. Now I work on land, far away from the stormy sea and the ghostly nights of the platform. I am an instructor for radio operators and use every opportunity to tell young people, always pay attention to every frequency, especially the old and seemingly abandoned ones. Sometimes, I explain to them, the most important warnings come from the places you least expect, and I remind them that secrets, like the pressure in defective valves, always find a way to come to light, no matter how deep you try to bury them. Although the nights are quieter now, there are moments when I hear the faint crackling of a frequency and think of those long past warnings. The truth can never truly be suppressed, and the past, well, the past never completely dies.